to this episode of the Event Manager Podcast by Skift Meetings, the podcast for curious event professionals embracing the future of business events. My name is Miguel Neves, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Skift Meetings. And in this episode titled The European Perspective on Event Tech, I have the pleasure of speaking with Thorben Grosser, the Vice President of Product Marketing and Events at EventMobi. Our conversation revolves around event tech, event design, and how to run a successful event tech business in Europe. We talk about things like the current state of the event tech industry, how have events and event tech changed pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, the differences between doing business in North America and Europe, how Thorben would like to see in-person events transform in the near future, and what changes need to take place for the event industry to thrive. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation, and I invite you to check out the other episodes of the podcast, which you can find on our website or by subscribing through your favorite podcast service. Hello and welcome to the Event Manager Podcast. On this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Thorben Grosser. Thorben, thank you for joining us on the show.
I'm just as delighted as you are. Hello.
Thorben, you're with EventMobi. I know you have a new job title, and I want you to talk a little bit about, your journey. Tell us a little bit about your journey from finding the event industry to your current role, if you will.
Oh, Jesus. That's okay. I'm trying to make this as short as possible, but also kind of cover the important steps. So I'm VP of product marketing at EventMobi, and I've been with EventMobi for 11 years. But even before that, I kind of have been working in events for 10 years before. So it's almost been like 20 years now. I grew up in Luxembourg and I loved going to the movies. And there was this small cinema in the town next to us. And I knew the guy who ran that cinema. And he told me that they were going to shut down because nobody was coming to the movies anymore. And I was like, oh my God, no, you can't do this because this is the only cinema I can get to by bus. I was 15, I didn't have a car. And he's like, yeah, but nobody's coming. So, what are we going to do? And I told him, maybe you need to put out flyers, maybe you need to put out a website and all that stuff. And he told me, yeah, I don't know how to do any of those. So tough luck. And then, when you're 15, you think you can do everything. And I essentially said, well, I can do all these things. And I started creating a website. I started creating flyers and distributing them around town, and started also working in that cinema as a projectionist, which was a beautiful job. It was still 35 millimeters film back then. And essentially, once I got into that, I started organizing short film festivals, open air film festivals, and all that stuff. And I just naturally gravitated towards events, even though I still wanted to study medicine. And then I failed getting into medical school. And
Many great things come from failing to get into medical school and other schools, but hopefully this is one of them.
Many great things come from failure. And so I told my mom, I'm just going to study chemistry for a year and then try again with medical school. And I think I really owe this one to my mom. She said, well, why don't you study something that you enjoy? And then you can try medical school next year instead, just studying something that, makes sense because it may help you for medical school. And I didn't know what I enjoyed. And my mom said, well, you've been doing events all along. Maybe you can study that. And I was like, I don't know if anybody can study that, but it turns out you could study that in Scotland. And I moved to Edinburgh to study events. And then after like a couple of months, I decided to not apply to medical school because I just enjoyed it so much. And that's been the story ever since. And so I met the CEO and founder of EventMobi while I was writing my bachelor's thesis. And I interviewed him for that. And I interviewed a bunch of other companies as well. And because this was 2012, and so the event tech industry was just kind of starting to come of age very early. And he asked me if I wanted to work for him. And I was like, I don't even have my final exam yet. And he's like, you figure it out. You figure it out. And so I was like, okay, I'll figure it out. And yeah, that back then we were 12 people. Now we're, I think, like maybe 110 or so. And that's been the story. This is how I ended up in events. It
What a
just
great story. I
came
like,
naturally.
yeah, I love this kind of from movies to events to event technology. Um,
Yeah, I always wanted to work in film related events, so film festivals and cinemas and so on. But it's not the greatest part of the industry to be in, because it's so hard to work sustainably in anything that's related to arts. So, working for an event tech supplier worked out. And I remember that when I was studying event management, I thought, okay, I never want to end up in the MICE industry because everybody's wearing suits and it's just so dull. But once I ended up there, I, I, it just changed. It's actually a really cool industry and I really enjoy it.
nice to hear you say that. And yeah, my story is not too different in terms of the more of the music industry rather than the cinema industry, and then getting into events. But we'll save that for another day. I wanted to pick on. I know that you really headed the Event Mobi European office.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us a little bit about that. And I'm particularly interested because I know a lot of US, and I know VetMobi is based in Canada, so it's a little different, but US, North American companies that sort of, make the leap to Europe, expand. And in my experience, a lot of them fail. Like, it's not
Yeah.
easy to have a European presence that actually makes sense. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. Like, I think it was pretty successful, and you can talk about why you're not doing that anymore if you want to. But also, why do you think that worked or works in Event Mobi's case?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I mean, if you read any business book, there's 100,000 cases of North American companies, especially US companies, trying to make it in Europe and then failing brutally. There's a famous Walmart story. There's Disneyland that at first was a catastrophe when they opened in Paris in, I think, 92 or so. And these mistakes that these companies made are still being made today. So doing business in Europe, in the end of the day, it's still business, but there's a lot of intricacies that are very, very different. So it really starts with the needs that Europeans have. So if you look at any North American website, for example, they use a lot of words like awesome, the best, industry leading, best in class, and so on. And to a lot of Europeans, these words don't mean a lot necessarily. And it's not because they don't speak English. You can, in many countries, perfectly do business in English. It's just because there's a very different tone that European customers in general have. And so the first thing is that you need to adapt to that tone. The second thing that is very different is the legal compliance. So you sometimes feel that Americans have like a Hakuna Matata, like a no worries approach to doing things, whereas Europeans and especially Germans, we work a lot with German customers. They worry about a lot of things, including privacy, IT security, all these things. And so if you don't take them seriously, or if you dismiss them, or just say, don't worry, they're not gonna bite. And I think the last thing that's really important is that a lot of North American companies see Europe as a big country, which it is not. It was 28 countries, now it's 27 countries again, I think the European Union alone, and then a few countries here and there. And every country works very, very differently. And so it helps having people in individual countries that kind of understand how these people work. And it's much easier for somebody, for example, in New York to work with somebody in Texas than for somebody in Denmark to work with somebody in Spain, even though geographically the distance may be the same. And I think that's something that a lot of North American companies don't really get, that you need to adapt to that. And then one more thing that I also want to add there is that also working with staff in Europe is very, very different. So a lot of countries like Germany, like France, they have a very, very strong culture of workers' rights. And so you can't necessarily play the North American way of hiring and also letting people go and changing things in companies. So it's a bit more slow, but it's also maybe a bit more consistent. And the reason why it worked at Event Mobi is, I would almost say, because we didn't have any clue what we were doing. So our CEO essentially tasked me to build this office. He didn't know how to run an office in Europe. I didn't know how to run an office in Europe. I learned it on the go. And he just sometimes thought that the things that we were doing were slightly strange, but as long as we were, successful as an entity, he would not really interfere with that. And so I think that would be my tip to any North American founder launching an EU operation or Europe operation, is just to get somebody that has a good understanding of how things work down there, and then let them do their thing. And if you don't understand why people need, 5 or 6 weeks of vacation, then that's fine. You don't have to understand that. Just let them do their thing.
Yeah, really interesting advice there, and thank you for being so open about it. I heard part of it is, the trust element seems like it's a really important thing. That idea of the language and the way you describe the company and the way you do business. I feel like the building of the trust is different in different European countries than it is in North America. That how do you get an audience to feel like you're a company that they want to do business with? And I think you're right in terms of how every country in Europe is quite different. And that's not always easy to understand from a sort of US or North American perspective. You have these like EMEA kind of markets, and you're responsible for like this huge geographical region. And they're so different, the different countries, and there's so many different laws and regulations. If you really look into it, it's like, no wonder it fails if you have the same policy across that whole region in many times.
Yeah, and I mean that also means if you're a North American business, that also means that you'll end up with more overhead, and your staff cost is going to be more expensive. But if you have a product that has a margin that justifies doing that, then it can work. But you just need to rid yourself of the idea that you can do whatever you did in the US and just replicate it the same way in Europe. That's going to backfire immensely. And I think we saw that with a lot of our competitors coming, not only competitors, but also other companies in the event tech space coming into Europe. And then after 1.5 years, leaving again, because for them, it didn't seem to work. But it's also sometimes very obvious where the challenges and where the issues were.
Yeah. You mentioned also that, the holiday, but also the sort of, I guess, the social support system that most countries have in Europe that, is much more tighter, or there's much more support available for staff. Do you think that that's also an important factor when you're looking at the sales and convincing people of, why they should use product A or why they should kind of work with a company? Because the European buyers maybe have a slightly different mindset in terms of their social security kind of frame.
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
I guess what I'm saying is, in North America, you can lose your job very quickly, right? Mm-hmm. You have this you have to make decisions very quickly because there's a lot of pressure. In Europe, with most European countries having more of a social security network, that you're not as at risk. Do you feel that changes the way you do business and you close business and you kind of get sales?
I don't think so. So I think what you're getting at is if European buyers are, generally speaking, maybe more open to taking risks because they know that they can't be punished. And that's actually not the case. European buyers are very much trying to control the risk in many points. So in that way, it's not working out.
Yeah, I feel like, I think it's a good point. Maybe it's sort of the inverse in a way, because there's less of a drive to take risks in a way, because you have that social security, because you're not as at risk of something failure. The actual drive to invest in something new or to look for new solutions to something may be less present, would you say?
That may be one of the reasons. I'm not too sure why Europeans are that way. I mean, definitely taking risks is less encouraged in many European contexts. There's not this idea of that American dream that if you just work hard enough, you can become anything, which also by now everybody knows that that's not how it works, even in North America. But yeah, I think there's just, generally speaking, less of a culture of, making a fuss about things and more a culture of providing very solid work in a lot of places. And I think that's also one of the things that sometimes struck us as a company, that we have an office in Berlin, Germany, and people go on decently long breaks and they finish on time, they start on time. But what quite often, so sometimes it seems like there's less of a willingness to put in the extra work. But what quite often doesn't get seen is that these people show up at 9 a.m. and usually they take about 2 or 3 minutes to get themselves a coffee, but then they go to their desk. Like there's not a lot of chatter, there's not a lot of water cooler stuff going on, which is very much part of a North American office culture. But you come in at 9 a.m., you get your coffee, you sit down at your desk, and you work. So in the end of the day, it looks like people in Europe may work less, but they get done at least the same. But also, if you look at stuff like GDP, most of the time they actually get done more.
Yeah, really interesting. It's we could do a whole episode just on that. But I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about you kind of stepped aside from that role in the last year or so, right? You were managing the whole office. Could you talk a little bit about that and kind of your reasons behind that and what you're doing now?
Yeah, for sure. So I built that office and I kind of built it up to be a stable operation. And what happens once that you reach a certain size, managing an office becomes just a lot of admin work and paper pushing and so on. And that's not really what I'm passionate for. The other reason why I kind of step back is I'm a really good all-rounder. I can do everything. I'm not excellent at anything, which if you're starting a company and if you're growing it is an incredibly valuable skill to have. However, once we reached a certain size in Europe, it made more sense to bring in more experts that are more focused on, sales, marketing, customer experience, and have them take that over, because they are much better at doing what they do than I am. They are more focused to what they do. And so that was kind of a good step to change. And then also over my time at Event Mobi, I have developed an incredible interest in product. And so I wanted to focus more on the product and decide having an influence in how our product comes along. And so I tried to do that for a couple of times to kind of shift laterally within the company, but then you always get pulled back into your old job. And then eventually the plan that my partner and I kind of had was to just step out for a year entirely until everybody realizes, oh, we're actually totally fine without Thorben. We can totally do it without him, and then step back into that new role. And that's what we've done.
Okay. And I don't want to put words in your mouth and tell me if I'm reading it wrong, but was there an element of mental health, of also sort of taking care of yourself in this kind of refocusing and taking a sort of break away from the company?
I wish I could say that, and I wish I could say that something that everybody will share on LinkedIn about how my life changed and so on. But the reality is I took pretty well care of my mental health throughout most of the time at Event Mobi. So I put stops in early enough. I learned to recognize signs of being overworked and so on. So the stepping back for a year really was more the fulfillment of a dream or the fulfillment of a wish. It had less to do with, I need this now, or if not, I'm just going to fall apart completely.
Okay. And you went traveling during that year, I believe, right? You were sort of remote or fully remote for a lot of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, for a year completely, I didn't do any work whatsoever, which was incredibly nice. And then we added another half year where we worked remotely on the road from a van, which was a fun experience, which is also a really tiring experience. Living and working on a van is just so tough. If you ever see all these van life pictures on Instagram, yeah, that's part of van life, but the part that they don't show you is also just insane. But yeah, so I was away completely for a year and then worked remotely for half a year.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, I wanted to jump into kind of the state of event tech at the moment. We're recording this 12th of July, 2022. We've just heard, Hopin just announced some big rounds of layoffs. We had Hubelo, Bizzabo as well. Big companies in event tech losing a lot of staff, cutting headcount. Obviously, the downturn, we're not officially in a recession yet, but there's definitely an economic downturn, or there's definitely some worries in that area.
I'm sometimes wondering, everybody's so worried about the recession, if we just turn it into a self-fulfilling prophecy at this point. If the recession is just going to happen because everybody says it's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, you could be right. I wrote about this, writing about it a lot, about sort of a perfect storm hitting the event tech industry. I guess just wanted to get your impressions on that, your view in it from your perspective, and what you're thinking may come next.
Yeah, that's a very tough question. I mean, over the past 2 years, ever since the pandemic started, we have tried to look into the future a lot about what's going to happen next, and every time we were wrong. So we kind of stopped making predictions about what's going to happen in the future. What's happening right now, I mean, it's when I read the news of Hubelo or Hopin letting people go, that's breaking my heart. I mean, even though they are competitors, the market is so big that, generally speaking, and that's one of the things I really like about the event tech industry. We all have pretty good relationships to each other. So seeing somebody else having issues and having challenges is just heartbreaking. And I can promise you, there's nobody popping champagne every time an article such as that comes out. With Event Mobi, it's a bit different because we, as a company, we never had any funding, so we never grew extremely fast. We grew fast. We once were one of the 50 fastest companies in, I think, North America or Canada or something like that. But we never grew crazy fast. And so if you grow crazy fast, the moment something in the industry or in the economic world changes, that usually causes issues. And if venture capitalists pour money into companies, they know this and they foresee this. So in a certain regard, while on a personal level, obviously this is extremely tragic, but if you look at how a lot of these companies work, that's kind of not too surprising, because it's risk capital, it's venture capital. So that's what happened, and we saw this in the past with companies like Double Dutch, for example, who came in extremely strong onto the market and then also faced similar issues. The big challenge here is to understand what's going on in the industry right now, because there's a huge, at least from my perspective, there's a huge discrepancy between what you see and what you know. So right now, if you talk to anybody that's doing work for on-site events, even at Event Mobi, the teams that work with the customers that have events right now, or convention centers or hotels, any of those, it's crazy. They have to turn business away. They have to turn away more business than ever. And that's not only because they may have let go staff during the pandemic that they're now missing. They genuinely have a lot of business. And then by the same time, if you look out into the future, you see that everybody is very unsure about autumn and winter. Everybody is really unsure about what's the place that virtual events are going to cover and what's the place of live events. And adding to that, obviously, is the looming recession. And that makes it really, really hard. I personally think that we're probably in for a bit of a metaphorical winter. So it's going to be tough for a couple of quarters. I don't know right now whether it's going to be catastrophic, because at least those companies that can kind of handle both the online and the in-person side of events, there's always going to be something for them. And as long as it's clear where we're headed as society, I think we will be fine. The only thing that we're seeing is that people are more cautious in spending. So it's much more difficult right now to kind of do any crazy contracts. It's still, you can still do your solid work. You can still sell things and help event planners make their events better. But everybody's just a bit more cautious right now. And I don't foresee that changing for a couple of quarters.
So, I mean, Eventmo, we are one of the, long-running company, coming from event apps and registration and that kind of thing. And then you have the virtual side that comes in during the pandemic. Can you share any sort of sense of how much is still virtual in terms of your focus and your sales, and how much is really just on the in-person side?
Yeah, actually, we run these numbers regularly, and we also run these numbers into the future, looking at what kind of new interested prospects we have at Eventmobi. So we kind of have an ability to look into the future, at least in a very limited scope. And to me, it seems that the virtual business side is probably going to stay hovering around 20 to 25%, unless obviously there's a new lockdown coming in which case it will very, very fast pivot to almost 100% again. What's more interesting is what's happening to these other 75 or 80%. Are they all in-person events, or are they also hybrid events? And we actually see that the hybrid event chunk currently hovers around, I think, 15%, but it is slowly growing. So there may be a scenario where every event in the future is just going to end up being a hybrid event of some sort, which personally I believe is probably the right thing to do. But yeah, it's kind of 1/4 virtual events to 3/4 on in-person events of some sort, hybrid or not.
Fascinating. And thank you for sharing that. And I think what I think is quite interesting is looking at, if we kind of just look at the in-person side of things for a moment, or at least, I guess hybrid will probably be a part of this. But if we think about, where we were at with event technology in 2019, before this crazy thing called the COVID pandemic, and if we think about, if we assume that 2023 will be largely post-pandemic, I always use post-pandemic with a pinch of salt because we never really know what's going to happen. But if we assume
we said this about 21 and 22 as well.
Exactly. If we assume that there's a sort of, pretty strong confidence in not being forced to go virtual, how do you think events have changed? Are we using technology better? Is there a kind of a higher expectation of what technology can do? Or are we sort of back to exactly the same place and sort of using it in the same way?
I have opinions on that question.
Great. That's why we're here.
So, when the pandemic started, obviously everything was grim and everything was terrible, and nobody knew what was going to come from this. And I kept thinking, if one thing comes from this that's positive, then it's at least that we're going to learn how to use digital tools and how to improve our events and how to put more meaning into events. And like this is the right chance for the event industry to reset, realign, and come out stronger of this, because even pre-pandemic, the events industry had a lot of issues. And so that was also kind of powered by this sheer will to experiment during the pandemic. I mean, we did the craziest, our customers did the craziest things. They tried the weirdest kinds of audience engagement that worked, some of it didn't. And it was just so refreshing to see every week there was somebody that tried something new. And so I thought, okay, if we can keep up this spirit, then we're in for good ride here. And then after my first big trade show after the pandemic was in North America, and I went to that trade show, and it just looked the same. And I was so disappointed. And actually that sense of disappointment in some regards has also stayed with in-person events for now. So we see a lot of people, a lot of event organizers just picking up where they left things. And that's a bit disheartening, quite frankly, because we have learned so much. And I remember that before the pandemic, when we tried to talk to customers about event technology, they were really worried about, maybe older attendees not being able to use software or technology that well, even though back at that stage, that was mostly not true already. And then I thought, okay, now that we all have been through is this on? Can you hear me? For 2 years, we know everybody has figured it out, but for some reason, these worries are back with event planners. So these same arguments about, can they use technology? They're back, even though we saw that everybody can, not everybody, but most people can do it now. So I don't see a lot of change, quite frankly. But I will say this. My last hope is that right now we're kind of in this rebound phase where we've been deprived from in-person events for 2 years, and now we're going back to in-person events, and we just want to have what we always had, and it was really nice. And I hope that maybe once everybody got their fix of in-person events, we start thinking about, but actually this thing worked really well with virtual events. Maybe we can incorporate that into live events because we know how to do it. So maybe right now we're just in a rebound phase and we're just jumping into what we always knew, and eventually get around to putting that change into our industry. But for now, I don't see a lot of change, quite frankly.
I tend to agree with you on quite a lot of that. Can you paint a picture of what you think you'd like to see? I mean, what the technology is capable of. What would you like to see events do in the kind of close future that is possible, but they're not doing yet? And I'm talking more about the in-person side of events.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I would love everybody to consider is having a proper hybrid strategy, because one thing that happened with virtual events when we did them, and it seems like nobody remembers this anymore, but we suddenly started attending the oddest virtual events where maybe they were out of our industry, they were out of our time zone, they were out of our cohort. Suddenly we found ourselves in events that we never would have attended in person, which we can do because they are now virtual. And this is talking from an able-bodied perspective. Now imagine what this means for people that may have disabilities, or maybe people that are caring for a child, a family member, or anything, who cannot travel. For a lot of these people, this was really almost like a golden age because they could attend these events. And so I would have assumed that event organizers, event owners would have seen that opportunity and continued to cater for these groups when pure in-person events don't do that. So that's one thing that I really hope works, or that is going to come back, that we will take more care of those that cannot physically attend the event or don't want to attend the event. Because quite frankly, an event is stressful. Traveling is stressful, even before the entire travel chaos that we're in right now. And so it's just making it, yes, you're missing some parts of attending an event that are fun, but you're getting other parts back. So enabling people to do that is one thing. The other thing that I really hope is that we also consider the necessity of a lot of events. I think one thing we saw with virtual events is that we can actually teach people things online much, much better through learning management systems, podcasts, videos, all different kinds of formats where you as the learner can kind of consume content in a way you want to. And that's not really possible at on-site events because the event organizer controls the entire experience. And so I wish that events would more focus on what they're really good at, which is the emotional bit, and it's the networking bit, and it's everything that really touches our senses. And we would move learning events maybe to a more online version, making it more accessible for people that don't want or can't travel, but also B, traveling, especially long distance travel, is a big issue. And we as the events industry, we rely a lot on long distance travel, and really the writing is on the wall that we shouldn't be doing that. So I think we could kind of mitigate that that climate crisis that we're in right now, also by reducing the number of in-person events and making the in-person events that we're doing more meaningful.
Do you have, I mean, I think this is a fascinating topic. Do you have any examples of organizations that are doing this well?
I mean, right now, everybody is still trying to figure out what they're doing. We're just out of the pandemic, and we're trying to, it's going to take a year or 1.5 years before we kind of figure out what we're going to do. And I cannot quote you with a particular example that I think this is a best practice that we have seen. But
can you maybe go into the reasons why you think you're not seeing that? Is it just too soon, or are there barriers that are kind of stopping people?
Well, I think the biggest barrier is that a lot of us learned how to run an in-person event. A lot of us now learned forcibly how to run an online event, but nobody really knows how to run a hybrid event, or to combine these two really, really well. And we're still in an experimenting phase. But what's different from the experimenting phase during virtual is that we actually have a fallback. We have something that we've always known, which is pure in-person events. So as soon as a lot of event organizers run into challenges, they're just going to go back to fallback events, which is in-person events. One case I know pretty well personally was an organization, an association that ran a hybrid event a couple of months ago. And they had a lot of issues kind of capturing the video and the sound on site and bringing it online. And what the board of that association is essentially saying is, well, if you can't do it, then next year maybe better do a pure in-person event because you know how to do that. And while I understand where this motivation is coming from, I'm 100% confident that that association learned all of their lessons this time around. So let them have another go at it and let them try, because it would bring so much more value to the association. But by the same time, event planners have this pressure to get things right. And there's this freedom for experimentation that we had during the virtual time, because there was nothing else we could do, has kind of gone.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But I mean, we both attended a number of Fresh conferences and other events that were hybrid, a long time ago. lots of learnings, lots of things that worked, lots of things that didn't work. We have people that we know that have worked, like Garrett and Hardy, who've worked in hybrid events essentially way before the pandemic, and continue to do that.
Yeah.
But yet you mentioned that we're all still learning. What would you say to people like that have been sort of experimenting and doing these things for over 10 years now? Is it that the formats that they work on only work in a specific kind of situation? Or is it that the industry maybe is afraid of kind of new business models? Or, because you mentioned, for example, content being online. And I think that's very valid. And the hybrid strategy where you have a sort of longer term plan for the in-person events, etc. But I also could see from many organizations' perspectives that that's a gamble for them. Like they're feeling that people come in person to consume the content. And if you do it online, maybe they won't come, or maybe the marketing is going to be very different. Are we kind of stuck here somewhere?
It seems like it. And the people you mentioned that have been doing hybrid events for now 10 years, honestly, these people are my heroes. And what they're doing is perfectly transferable to any event. And it's not like they're doing something that is so niche and so unique that it only works if you run an event like they do. I think the biggest challenge here is that a lot of event organizers, and this is also something, by the way, people like Garrett would say, probably. Ask Garrett.
But you don't want to put words in his mouth, but
I don't want to put words in his mouth. But that's a lot of event organizers still don't know why they're doing events. And the challenge is if you just slap a hybrid component on an event where you don't know why you're doing it, that may go wrong, because whatever you do at an event should always be in line with your event goals. Now, if you don't really have clearly defined event goals, then that's really hard to do. And guys like Ruth and Garrett and so on, they've been touring the planet now with their event canvas, which is, as awesome as it is, essentially just about finding out why you're doing this event. And this question, as simple as it sounds, people are still not really confident with. And I think that's one of the challenges. If you knew what your event goals were, it would be very, very apparent to how to bring in an online or hybrid component. Now, the other thing that I want to address, which grinds my gears every time I hear it, is this fear of people not attending in-person formats if there's an online format instead. There's a couple of things here to dissect. Firstly, if you do an online format and people will not attend your in-person format anymore because of that, well, that means the in-person format has issues, because if the in-person format was that good, they would attend it. The second thing to note here is that, yes, I understand where this fear of cannibalization, as they always call it, comes from. And that's also a very logical conclusion at first. But if we look at it historically, the German Football Association, the DFB, wasn't showing football games on TV, I think, until the mid-90s or so. They were only showing one football game every weekend. And it was only in the mid-90s that they started doing all the football games. And the reason why they were not doing is because they were worried about empty stadiums. Once they started kind of taking the plunge and kind of showed the football games online, they sold billions in TV licenses. And also the stadiums were packed, and they still are. And this is also, there's not too much research, but the research that we have on hybrid events, there's not a single hybrid event that has lost an audience over going hybrid or offering a online portion. And I understand where the fear comes from, but the data is there, and the data is, we obviously, you can always need more data and you can always use more data, but the data is pretty clear that it's not going to happen. Yep. And so people just need to stop worrying and doing it, for God's sake.
I'm familiar with the study, and I think the cannibalization kind of fear has largely been disproven. I guess the area that I'm still stuck on to some extent is the marketing angle. because of the way we market in-person events, the way we market conferences. If you're then kind of saying, hey, let's consume the content online and come and network at our event, even events like IMEX that are largely about networking, about being there because everybody else is there, market themselves a lot around the content, the speakers that are going to be there, the things that you're going to be able to see while you're there. And so I think that there is a fear on the marketing side that I haven't seen too many events take that plunge and say, hey, we're not going to talk about the people that you're going to see on stage. We're going to talk about how great it's going to be to network and how many connections you're going to make and stuff. Yes, it's part of it, but I feel like the attraction of the keynote speaker is still a huge part of the marketing for a lot of these events.
Yeah, and I mean, that's totally understandable. And I remember traveling to, I'm a bit into space travel, and the guy who was the ground commander on the first moon landing was a keynote speaker at PCMA Convening Leaders in 2020, I think, just before the pandemic started. And that speaker alone made me travel to that event. I mean, I kind of had the event on my radar, but that speaker was kind of what changed my mind that I absolutely have to go to this event. And there is something about being in the same room with, that guy or Condoleezza Rice or Bill Clinton or any of these big keynote speakers that come there. And yes, it's not the same watching them online, but at the same time, if we look at the TED conferences that have been essentially hybrid in a way forever, in the way that they put all the recordings online afterwards, they have found a good approach to marketing both sides. So I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have keynote speakers at events. Quite the opposite. There's also something about the energy in the room that is very unique to in-person events if you have an amazing keynote speaker. But what I'm saying is that just because online events may not have that same energy, it doesn't make them less valuable. And I think what you're quoting is actually a perfect example of how a hybrid approach can work, because yes, people are probably going to want to watch this person online speak about whatever they're talking about, but also bringing them on site is still a huge draw for the on-site event. So it works beneficial for both of these parties. One of the things where this doesn't work necessarily is when you do it the other way around. So we see a lot of online conferences right now kind of trying to one-up each other with having the most spectacular keynote speaker and kind of having the most amazing and most expensive speakers. And I remember attending a conference by a software company called Notion, which is not in the event space, but I attended their online conference mainly because one of my podcasting heroes, Ira Glass from This American Life, was doing a keynote there. And I watched it and I was like, this doesn't make sense. Like, why is he talking at this online event? Like, I can watch Ira Glass talk somewhere else. So what was the challenge is that there was a disconnect between the topic of the conference and the keynote speaker, which at an in-person event, you kind of get away with, but in an online event, you no longer get away with. So I think for in-person events, having an amazing keynote speaker, still a big pull, but for online events, I think the audience is much, much more critical because they're not getting this excitement from being in the same room with somebody they really admire.
Yeah, fascinating. And I really, I think that was Block by Block, the Notion conference, right?
Yeah, it was a good conference, but I just didn't get the point of Ira Glass being there, even though I love Ira Glass, but it just didn't fit into the concept.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I can definitely recall other in-person events where you could say exactly the same thing for many keynote speakers. You're like, okay, this is interesting, but I don't see the relevance. Or even worse, it wasn't that interesting, and I don't see the relevance, which is a really bad sign, right?
Isn't this the worst when you travel somewhere for a keynote speaker and then you realize, oh, they're actually not the cool person I thought they would be?
That is a very bad impact of an event. Let's hope no events do that. Thorben, wanted to kind of just ask you a little bit of an oddball question, but kind of related to what we've been talking about. If you could change anything about the event industry, what would you change?
I'm not having a stroke. I'm just thinking.
Putting you on the spot, but we've been talking about so many things where there are challenges with the event industry. So I was thinking, I'm sure there's something in there that would be the thing that grinds your gears the most, I guess.
Yeah, so I think there's two angles to this. What I want to change and what I think we have to change. And I want to start with what we have to change. And it's our industry is still really, really bad when it comes to our climate footprint. And I can see by your face that you knew that I was going to say this. It's really frustrating to be in an industry which is in large parts built on putting people on airplanes, putting them into large convention centers that have an enormous energy footprint, and feeding them what to this day still mostly is meat. So I'm not a vegetarian myself. I'm also not like super crazy fanatic in a lot of regards, but it just we as an industry need to figure out how we can create value to the people that use our services without putting them on airplanes, without putting them into massive convention centers, and without feeding them meat. And so that's the one thing that I think we as the event industry need to address and should have started addressing 20 years ago, really. We just need to not everything, but a lot of things that our industry is built on are inherently opposed to achieving climate goals. And for whatever reason, we as an industry still quite often tend to replace plastic straws by glass straws and say, hey, we did something. When really, no, keep your plastic straws. If you don't board a plane for that, keep your plastic straws. So I think we need to be more honest to ourselves. And I know this is going to be difficult. And I also have no idea how organizations such as CVBs, for example, can kind of manage this, because their entire job is to get people to put other people on airplanes. And that's kind of where they have their strengths. But we need to stop doing that, because for the foreseeable future, air travel is not going to be carbon neutral. So we need to find a way to have less travel and maybe a bit smaller events. And, any event that I've seen so far that stopped serving meat and didn't tell people, nobody would notice. So just, reduce meat, or at least, you don't have to stop it. You should stop it completely, but reduce it if you don't dare to stop it completely. Stop thinking that chicken for breakfast, dinner, and lunch is the right thing to serve at an event. I don't know. We need to address this climate crisis.
You mentioned another issue that you would like to change if you could, right?
Oh yeah, what I wanted to change if the climate crisis wasn't the most pressing issue at our hands right now would essentially be that we as an industry need to get it into our DNA to just regularly think about our event goals, kind of tying back to what I said early on, because there's so much discussion about tools and technology and all of that, and what are the right tools and the right technology to use. And all this discussion becomes redundant the moment you realize why you're having your event. Because the moment you realize why you're having your event, it becomes very obvious how to run your event. The problem is we're still not good enough at asking that question. And if we could become much better at asking that question, then that would solve a lot of issues. And, there's people like Ruud Janssen and Garrett Jessen and the entire event design crew that have been, as I said, traveling the planet now for a decade, trying to get people to do that. And it's getting better, but they're still, they probably converted about 1% of the event planners. There's still 99% to do.
Great. Well, hopefully we can find other ways of getting people to focus on objectives and goals, which I think is always a great thing. Thorben, we've been almost an hour talking, and I think it's flown by. Wanted to wrap up and ask you for your recommendation on who we should have next on the Event Manager podcast.
Oh, I get to make a recommendation. That's exciting. I don't want to say the obvious people because they're probably going to end up on your podcast anyway. Somebody I would love to have and to listen to on this podcast is, do you know? Yeah, you probably know him because he was in the industry like some time ago. Do you remember Paulo Loza?
Yes, the name sounds familiar.
He used to work for MCI, and he was really, really big on data. And he left the events industry, I would say, about 5 years ago to go into business consulting, and is now doing a lot of other things. And I would love to have him kind of come back and talk about the events industry now that he's gained some distance to it, because he's incredibly smart. And maybe also, just while I'm at it, because I also want to balance this a bit, somebody else that people should listen to more is one of my former professors, Professor Rebecca Finkel at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, who's a lot into social justice issues and things like sexism and any kind of isms in context of events. I think that's also something that we as the industry, we still haven't had our Me Too moment, and we still need to go through the motions and discuss a lot of things that are happening or not happening at our events. And I think she would also make a fantastic guest. I now made 2 recommendations. Am I allowed to do that?
You're absolutely allowed to do that, and I will contact you to put us in contact with these people so we can have them as guests, and it would be my pleasure to host them both.
Wonderful.
Well, Thorben, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fascinating. We could probably talk for a few more hours on any of these topics, but let's wrap up here. I appreciate your time, and hope you enjoyed your time here at the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, it was an incredible honor to talk to you, as always. And thank you.